Why is leader line typically a lower pound test than the main line? We're going to answer that question and many more on today's episode of Fish It First. A lot of you want to know what type of line to use in each fishing situation, and there are already a lot of videos on YouTube that explain that. But even the pros disagree a little bit on what types of line to use in each fishing situation. So what I thought we'd do today is I'll break down the three types of line, the three main types of fishing line for you, break down the pros and cons, the attributes of each, so that you can become further educated on those and take that new knowledge and apply it to those other videos that you're watching, apply it to your on the water situations so that you can be picking the right line for each situation. Let's get to it. Now, there are three main types of fishing line. There's polyester braid, nylon monofilament, and fluorocarbon. There's also a newer type of line called copolymer, but we'll talk about that in a future video. Today, we're just going to talk about the three main types of line, and let's start with braid. Braid is exactly what it sounds like. It's braided polyester strands. Braided line tends to be quite abrasive if you run your fingers across the line. That abrasiveness helps it to cut through vegetation. Another thing that helps it with that is its very thin diameter. Pound for pound, out of all three of the lines, braid is the thinnest in terms of diameter, which not only helps it to cut through vegetation, but also to cut down deeper through the water column. That thin diameter also makes braid very castable. You're able to often cast very long distances with braided line. Because of its thin diameter, it can take quite a bit of braided line to fill a spool. What does that mean for you? Well, it means you may need to put some backer line or some other cheaper line down first on your spool, and then tie that to your braided line and finish spooling your reel with your braided line so that you're not using as much of that more expensive braided line. Speaking of spooling reels, if you're spooling braid directly to your reel, it has a tendency sometimes to slip on the reel. To prevent that, after you've tied your knot, tied your braid onto your reel, cinched it down to the reel, take a little piece of electrical tape, stick it on there, cinch it down, then start to spool your reel, and you'll find that you won't have issues with slippage. Guys, one of the huge advantages of braided line is its sensitivity. Now, on a taut line, meaning that you don't have any slack in the line, braid has the highest sensitivity bar none. If you've got all the slack out of that line, every little tick from a fish you're going to feel. So long as your rod is sensitive enough, you're going to feel those ticks. When you pull that jig over a little rock pile, you're going to be feeling that. And that is one of the huge advantages to braid. The reason why braided line is so sensitive when it is taut is because it essentially has no stretch, and that gives it another advantage. You can get pretty awesome hook sets with braided line. Whatever you put into the line on the rod end is going to get transmitted directly without any loss or stretch in the line, going to get transmitted directly to that lure, that jig, that hook, right to the top of the fish's mouth. Also, because braid doesn't have any stretch to it, it also doesn't have any memory. Well, essentially no memory. There's a little bit there, but essentially no memory. So you can wrap that tightly in a coil. You can wrap it around a tree limb. You can wrap it around your reel when you're spooling it on there. And when you pull that off, it's not going to retain that shape or any kinks or any coiling, which is great and lends itself very well to coming smoothly off of the reel. So, like as we said before, you can get those really nice, long, accurate casts. Another nice thing about braided line is how resilient it is in weather or in sunlight. You can spool that on at the beginning of the season and you're not going to have to respool until next season. So with all those great features, a lot of us would probably be throwing straight braid all the time if it wasn't for one major drawback. And that's that out of all three lines, fluorocarbon, mono, and braid is the most visible by far. And in situations where you're trying to do finesse fishing, maybe it's cold water, it's a highly pressured lake, maybe you're fishing a little bit deeper in clear water, in all those situations, line visibility plays a big role in your ability to catch those fish. So that is one of the bigger drawbacks of braid. You can take that disadvantage of the visibility factor, however, and turn it into an advantage for you. If you use a high visibility chartreuse or like a white braid that you can see really easily as your main line, and then you put like a fluorocarbon leader on there, you still get the advantages of the lower visibility of the fluorocarbon. But now, if you're on a taut line, yes, you're still going to feel it just like you would with any other braid, But on a slack line, because it's higher visibility, you're going to be able to see any little ticks or movements in the line that can tip you off that there's a fish down there that's grabbing onto that lure. So in what situations do we use braided line? Well, don't be afraid to use straight braided line in situations where you're throwing stuff in heavy vegetation. That vegetation is going to provide some visual cover for the line. That line's not going to be as visible. And that thinner diameter, that abrasive line, that tough line is going to work really well to cut through a lot of that vegetation. So for example, top waters like frog fishing, straight braid, great. Punching in heavy mats, straight braid is great. Now in pretty much every other situation that you can think of fishing, you can still use braid, but you want to take the advantages of braid, which is that amazing sensitivity on a taut line, but combine it with the advantages of fluorocarbon or monofilament, which is lower visibility. So you would want to do a braid main line with a fluorocarbon or a monofilament leader for most of your other fishing applications if you were going to use braided line. And I say if because there are other options. And on that note, let's move on to our next line, fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon line was invented in the 1970s, and it has some pretty significant advantages. Number one, and this is the biggest far and above all else, is that fluorocarbon is the most invisible line out of all three. The reason for that is because of refractive index. For those of you that like this kind of science stuff, here's what it is. The refractive index is to what degree a substance bends light. So the refractive index of water, for example, is 1.3. Fluorocarbon is 1.4, so not exactly the same, but pretty close to water. So while fluorocarbon is still technically visible in water, it's pretty darn close to invisible, especially relative to other lines like mono or braid. Now that invisibility factor can work big time to your advantage in certain situations, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now another factor of fluorocarbon that I really like is that fluorocarbon is the most sensitive line on slack line. So we talked about how braided line, when it is taut, it is by far the most sensitive line. But when braided line gets some slack in it, it loses a ton of sensitivity because it doesn't really have any retained memory. Whereas fluorocarbon tends to have some pretty high memory to it. So when you slackline fluorocarbon, a little bit of movement on this end still tends to put some movement through that slack and up to the rod. Now it's not an intense sensitivity. It's not like the degree of sensitivity that you would get on a taut line, for example, but it certainly is more sensitive than what you would be feeling on a slack line on braided line, for example. Another feature of fluorocarbon line is that it sinks, and why that matters is because if you have a lure, let's take a crankbait for example, that you need to get down deeper and you're not using fluorocarbon line, you probably want to switch. That fluorocarbon line is probably going to have a thinner diameter than, let's say, mono, for example, and it's going to sink. That's going to help you get those baits down deeper. Speaking of running lines deep, fluorocarbon tends to have the most shear resistance against sharp objects like zebra mussels and rocks. Earlier I talked about how braided line really doesn't have stretch to it. Fluorocarbon does have some stretch, but not a lot. There's a little bit of give there, but not a lot. We talked earlier about how fluorocarbon is the most sensitive line on a slack line, and that's because it tends to have a decent amount of memory. It tends to have some retention of its shape. So fluorocarbon can lead to a higher degree of line twist. It's very important for you to know that fluorocarbon line can burn with friction. Whenever you are tying fluorocarbon line to anything, make sure that before you cinch anything down, before you pull any knot down, before you adjust anything, that you get that line as wet as possible. Last thing you want is to be tying some fluorocarbon to some main line, maybe braid or something like that, and you don't get it wet enough, you cinch it down, you think you have a good knot, but in reality, some heat has actually melted down part of that knot. You get the fish of a lifetime, and your knot ends up breaking. Not because you didn't tie a great knot, but because that fluorocarbon burned. Don't let that scare you away from fluorocarbon though. As long as you keep it wet enough, you shouldn't have any problem. There are a lot of places where fluorocarbon tends to work pretty darn well. One of the main places would be as leader material. So there are a lot of situations where you could use braid as your main line so that you get all of that sensitivity on a taut line of braid. plus fluorocarbon as a leader. That fluorocarbon is as close as you are going to get to invisible to those fish. So you get the advantages of the sensitivity on the braided line when that line is taut, but you also get the advantages of the invisibility factor in terms of that presentation that you're giving to that fish. So fluorocarbon can really shine in a braid mainline to fluorocarbon leader, but I tend to also use fluorocarbon a lot of times when I'm flipping jigs, for example. A lot of guys don't do that. A lot of guys are doing braid to fluoro. I like to use straight fluorocarbon, and the reason for it, and also creature baits. If I'm like text posing a creature bait and throwing it out there, and the reason for that is because I like a lot of things to fall on a slack line, and I just can get more of a feel, especially if I keep my finger on the line, I can get more of a feel on those slack line bites. As that bait's falling down and that fish takes it, I can get more of a feel on that slack line with fluorocarbon than I can with that braided line to the fluorocarbon leader. So for me, in a lot of situations, whether I'm flipping or I'm yo-yoing jigs, or if I'm throwing crankbaits and running those, I just really tend to like fluorocarbon. The crankbaits, for example, is because with those small little treble hooks, sometimes if you've got braided line out to a shorter fluorocarbon leader and you get a fish on, you might give a little bit too much power there. You're not getting any stretch whatsoever in that braided line, and what can happen is sometimes you can pull those trebles right out of that fish's mouth. If you've got that straight fluorocarbon line over the length of that line, maybe your line's out there 30 feet or whatever, and you set the hook on that fish when it takes your crankbait, now you've got a little bit of give in there. You don't have a ton of give like you would with mono, which we're going to talk about in a second, so you can still get a good hook set, but you're not necessarily going to be ripping that bait or that little treble hook out of the fish's mouth. So I tend to use straight fluorocarbon quite a bit in a lot of different situations. Well, and with that, I already gave away one of the features of monofilament, so I guess we better move on to monofilament line. Now, nylon monofilament has been around since like the 1940s, been around for forever. And one of the things that's nice about monofilament line is that it is cheap. That's one of the reasons why when you go to Walmart and you buy one of their off-the-shelf rod and reel combos, it's probably, if it's got line on it, it's probably going to have some cheap monofilament line on it. Now, most of the time, guys hate that. They rip all that stuff off. That's all fine, but you can actually use that to your advantage. You can take that mono line and use it as backer material. Now, for some of you that are watching this, you know what backer material is. Bear with me for a second. I like to talk to those of you who don't know what backer is. Backing line or a backer material is simply an amount of line that you spool onto your reel before you put on the line that you actually want to use. And here's why. Let's talk about a bait caster, for example, although this applies to spinning reels as well. When you cast to get the best velocity, to get the best accuracy, to get the best flow of that line off of that reel, and also to get the proper action and to get the proper use of that ratio, that gear ratio on your reel, you really want that reel to be completely filled with line all the way up to almost the brim of the reel, right? You want to be filling that whole thing up so that it functions the best that it can. Well, let's say, for example, you're going to throw straight fluorocarbon on a reel. It can get pretty expensive to reel that entire reel, especially if you have a larger size reel. It can get pretty expensive to put just your straight fluorocarbon on there. Fluorocarbon's expensive. It's the most expensive out of all the lines, pound for pound. Braided line as well. Braided line has a very thin diameter, so it can take a lot of braided line in order to fill up a spool. So one of the advantages of monofilament being so cheap is that you can buy some of that monofilament, put that onto your spool, get that all started, fill up a decent chunk of that spool with your monofilament, then take that monofilament, tie it to your braid, tie it to your fluorocarbon, whatever it is that you want to actually be using to fish, and then spool that on top of your reel, on top of that monofilament. You're going to save yourself a bunch of money. You're going to be able to fill up that reel, and you just have to make sure when you do that you don't put so much monofilament on there that you are actually casting out there and getting monofilament to come off of the reel, right? Because you really don't want to be, especially like with the monofilament, you're probably going to be using lighter monofilament line, 8 pound, 10 pound, whatever. You really don't want to be relying on that line strength. And also, every time that we tie another knot in the line, tie two types of line together, it's another opportunity for there to be a failure. So you really don't want that spot where you've tied your monofilament backer to your main line to come off of the spool. If it does, you've put too much backer material on and not enough of the actual line that you want to be using. You got to take some of that backer mono off of there and then retie on the line that you want to use onto there. And that's going to work better for you. Okay, we talked about how fluorocarbon sinks, monofilament floats. So that plays a role because if you are using monofilament line, let's go back to the crankbait analogy, that can definitely have an effect on how deep you were able to get that crankbait. Also, monofilament tends to have the largest diameter pound for pound. Larger diameter line, it's going to be more difficult for that to cut down through the water column. So monofilament can make your crankbaits ride a little bit higher in the water column than they would if you were using fluorocarbon, for example. There are places where you can use that to your advantage, however. Again, if you wanted to run your crankbait a little bit higher in the water column, you could use mono. But where it really comes in handy, I think, are on Lindy rigs or Carolina rigs. Lindy rig essentially is a Carolina rig for walleye fishing, right? Having that monofilament leader on there that floats a little bit with that lighter presentation worm or floating worm or creature bait, lighter creature bait, whatever it is that you're using, that monofilament line can help to keep that bait a little bit more off of the bottom than a fluorocarbon line would. So Lindy rigs, Carolina rigs, those can be great situations for you to use monofilament. Monofilament is definitely less visible than braided line, but it is more visible than fluorocarbon. If we go back to that refractive index, again, water's 1.3, fluorocarbon is 1.4, and monofilament is 1.5. If two different substances have the same refractive index, it makes them essentially invisible. You can't tell the difference between one or the other because they're bending light to the same degree. So if you could get a line that had a refractive index of 1.3, it would be totally invisible. Fluorocarbon, again, close at 1.4. Monofilament, a little bit more visible at a refractive index of 1.5. Monofilament tends to have the most stretch of any line, so that can be great when you are fighting a fish, because as that fish is pulling and tugging, you're getting that nice stretch within the line, and that can be a little bit forgiving and help to keep that fish hooked up. Where it can be disadvantageous, however, is in your hook sets. If you've got a long monofilament leader or you're throwing straight monofilament, for example, there can be quite a bit of give and it can make it more difficult for you to drive that hook through the fish's mouth. Monofilament has quite a bit of memory, and that means that, like fluorocarbon, it can have some line twist issues. Another thing to know about monofilament is it can still burn. It's not as bad as fluorocarbon, but you still want to make sure that your line is wet before you cinch down any knots. All right, guys. I just took a break to have a root beer float and did not spill, miraculously, did not spill a single drop on this new white shirt. So basically I feel like nothing can stop me right now. Moving on, let's get to some questions. These were put together by friends of mine on just questions about lines in general. Going with the first question, how can you save money but still use high quality line? Well, we talked about this earlier. One way that you can do that is with backer material. Fluorocarbon tends to be the most expensive line. If you use a backer material, a mono backer or a braid backer, it can save you some money. Just make sure that when you're using backer material, you don't use too large of a diameter line for that backer material, because when you tie your backer to your main line, if you have too large of a knot there, that can actually catch. Or if you're using like braid, for example, you can have like braid as your main line with maybe a mono backer. If you have a big knot that's poking through, you can actually get more backlash issues and more bird's nests and hang up issues. So make sure that you're using a thin enough diameter if you are going to use backer. Next question. Are there advantages to colored line? Well, we talked earlier about how if you have a high visibility braid, that may be easier to see bites as subtle little jumps in the braided line. If you're using like a low vis green braid, for example, it's very hard to see on a slack line the difference between the braid and the water, and it can be tough to see those little subtle movements in the line. High visibility colored line, yeah, that could be advantageous. You know, there are some people that swear that red tinted line, like a red fluoro or red mono, becomes invisible at certain depths. I don't really buy that. I don't know, maybe you guys do. Let me know down in the comment section below what your thoughts are on the invisibility of red line as you go deeper in the water column. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. But for me, the advantages to colored line come with braid to pick up on a slack line bite. That did not go as planned. All right, next question. How often should I be changing my line out? Well, if you're not a tournament fisherman, then I would say with braided line probably once a season. So just change out your braided line at the beginning of the season, and your fluorocarbon and mono probably at least a couple of times a season. But you should always be checking your line for frays and nicks. If you're starting to notice some fraying or some nicks in your line, particularly if it's like leader line, for example, just cut above that and retie. Or if you've got to tie on a new leader, tie on a new leader. But don't neglect those nicks and that fraying, because those are signs of weakness. Those are increasing the odds that that line is going to break. You don't want to miss a fish of a lifetime because you neglected some frays or some nicks in your line. So take care of those. Switch the line out when it gets frayed. Switch it out when it gets nicked. But otherwise, once a season for braid and a couple of times a season for mono or fluoro. That one worked better. Okay, next one here. I'm marking fish on my Vexilar unit, but they won't bite. Is it possible the problem is the line and not the lure? It is possible, depending on what you're doing already. So if you're not already using fluorocarbon, you could try switching to fluorocarbon because it's going to be a more invisible line than monofilament would be. Another thing you could do is you could downgrade the size of the line. So let's give an example. Let's say you're ice fishing for walleye and you're using an 8 or a 6 pound line. You could downgrade that to a 5 or a 4 pound line, make sure it's fluorocarbon. Now you've got a smaller diameter line and it's fluorocarbon. It's going to be more invisible to those fish. That might make it more likely that you're going to get bit because maybe that line is just enough to set those fish off. But more importantly is a lot of times when you are marking fish but you're having trouble catching those fish, a lot of times what you're going to do is slow down your cadence, but you're also probably going to minimize the size presentation that you're presenting those fish. So going back to that situation where we're ice fishing for walleye, for example, we might take that bigger spoon that we've been using when those fish are more aggressive, and we might downsize it. But if you don't also downsize your line, you may not get the same effect out of that spoon. You may not get the same action, is what I'm trying to say, out of that spoon when you downsize it. Those bigger, heavier lines are stiffer and they can inhibit the natural or the designed motion of those smaller, lighter lures, jigs, spoons, whatever. So if you're going to downsize your presentation to try to catch more fish, be sure that you also downsize your line so that those baits, those lures are getting the proper action. Okay. Is more expensive line actually better? Well, so that depends. Like here, okay, so you're trying to save a buck here, right? And let's just take like fluorocarbon, for example. You're looking at fluorocarbon, you're looking at different brands, and you see that some brands are more expensive than others. Is more expensive line actually better? It depends. There's different processes for making these lines. Sometimes you're buying a name when you're buying a line. But one thing that you want to pay attention to where spending a little bit more can actually be better is in the diameter of the line. So sometimes when you spend more money, let's take for example, let's say like 12 pound fluorocarbon. And let's say we have 4 different brands. We go into Cabela's, Shields, we go into Bass Pro, whatever. We got 4 different brands, and you look at those fluorocarbon brands. They're all 12 pound, but look at them and see, does that most expensive brand have a smaller diameter line for the same pound test as those other brands? Because if it does, that might be advantageous, right? It's going to be less visible. It's going to cut through the water better. You're probably going to be able to get that down just a little bit deeper. But most importantly is that visibility factor. It's going to be less visible. So that's something to think about if you're gauging whether or not you're going to spend a little bit more on a line. Take a look at the diameters. And if you see that it's smaller, maybe that's something that's important to you. Maybe you want to spend a couple extra bucks. Great. What is a good, affordable fluorocarbon line? You guys already know this one. Cigar Red Label. Next, please. What do you do if you are hooking into fish but losing them before they get to the boat? Okay, well that all depends. Let's throw out some scenarios. So the question here is, what do you do? You're hooking into fish. I'm assuming that means that you're getting them on, you're bringing them in, but you're losing them before you get to the boat. It all depends. If you are using a fluorocarbon leader, the first thing that you can do is switch to monofilament. Monofilament leaders are going to have more stretch, more give than a fluorocarbon leader is. One of the first things that you want to do if you're losing fish is switch over to that monofilament leader. It's going to have some more stretch, it's going to be more forgiving, you're less likely to lose those fish. Other things that you can do. If you are using already monofilament line, how long is your leader? Is your monofilament leader ridiculously long? Because if it is, maybe there's too much stretch. You know, the longer that monofilament leader is, the more stretch over the length of that leader. And maybe you're getting too much stretch and you're not getting a good enough hook set into those fish. So that's one of the things that you can change. You can change out your hooks. You can change out the type of hook. Some hooks have different angles between where you tie on to the eye of the hook and the actual angle of the hook itself. And some of them have a little bit more room to be able to get that fish's lip in there than others do. So switching out the type of hook can sometimes be important. Making sure that you're using a sharp hook can be important. So if you're hooking into fish, you're losing them before they get to the boat, a whole bunch of things you can do. But line-wise, I would say switch to a mono leader, or if you already have one, try to shorten that mono leader. Okay, next one. Why is a leader line typically a lower pound test than the main line? Well, for one, a lower pound test is going to have a smaller diameter and be less visible to the fish, so that's one reason. But the main reason why we use a lower pound test line for the leader material than for your main line is because if you are going to have a break somewhere in the line due to whatever factors, you want that break to happen in your leader material. You don't want that to happen in your main line. If the break happens in your main line and you bombed a cast way out there and you get hooked up with something, you get caught on something, snagged on something, and you can't move to it, you're stuck there and you're going to have to pull and break off. You don't want to be breaking off on your main line and then having to re-spool. You'd rather have it break off on your leader, save all your main line, tie on a new leader, and you're right back out there fishing. So that is the main reason why you'll see somebody, for example, use a 12-pound braid with an 8-pound fluorocarbon leader. Okay, and finally, does reel spool size matter with regards to line? Yes, I think it does. I tend to favor larger reel spools. You can get more line on there. The drag tends to be a lot smoother coming off of a larger spool. You can get more line reeled up every time that you reel down. Like if you're gonna do a reel down hook set, you can pull a lot more line, get a better reel down hook set with that. And you tend to have, you still have the memory of the line, but you tend to get less tight coiling of the line, which is nice. But the thing that you have to think about is those coils that are coming off of that larger spool are bigger coils, and that may impact how well that goes through that first guide. So you may have to, if you've got like a larger spool size and you've got fluorocarbon on there, for example, you may have to have a little bit larger guide for that first guide so that those larger coils have an easy time going through there when you're casting and whatnot. And that, you know, we can't really think about these things in a box. Yeah, the reel spool size matters. The different types of line that you use in different situation matters. It's just, it's one of the reasons. There's so many independent factors. It's just one of the reasons why fishing is, in my opinion, without a doubt, for the pros out there that do it in tournament fish, it is one of the most challenging sports in the world, if not the most challenging sport. But anyway, guys, I'm not good at this. Anyway, guys, that is it. Now you know a whole lot more about fishing lines. Now when you go out and you watch those other videos and they're talking about different types of line, you are going to have a ton of background knowledge so you can get some context for what they're talking about, and you can decide for yourself. Do you agree with what they're saying? Would you do something a little bit different? And when you're out on the water, you can experiment, try these different things based off of what we talked about today, and see what works well for you. Let me know down in the comments section below if there's anything related to fishing line that you think I've left out of this video that's important for our viewers to see. Go ahead and leave that down in the comment section below. While you're down there, if you like this video, be sure to hit the little like button. And if you're not subscribed already, subscribe. Hit the little subscribe button and the little bell notification next to it so you get all the latest videos from Fish It First. We post a video every Wednesday and every Friday. I hope you guys are on the fish, and until next time, tight lines.